I'm with Nim Shapira, who's the director and producer of a new movie. You've just made a movie, Torn, the Israeli Palestine poster war in New York City streets. Nim, what is this movie all about?
So, thank you so much for having me. To tell you about the movie, I first need to talk about myself. So, I have been living, of course, you can hear that I have an Israeli accent that doesn't go away, but I've been living in New York for 13 years and I'm also an American citizen. And for me, the film, as a New Yorker, the film tells the story of New York since October 7. For the first 3 months, we've seen people from, young and old, from every ethnic background, tearing down posters of the 251 kidnapped hostages that were Hindus and Buddhists and Christians and Muslims and Jews from over 40 nationalities. And tearing down those posters was not only ugly, it was also anti American and anti freedom of speech. And I focus on the first 3 months of the war between October 7, 2023, to Thanksgiving of 2023, where about 100 hostages came out through hostage deal. And I'm basically following several New Yorkers that grapple with what's going on in the streets of New York, because not only the posters were torn, also the social fabric of the city was torn. And I'm talking to a lot of Jews, but I'm also talking to, I would call it, regular New Yorkers, to people that have skin in the game and to people that don't have skin in the game at all.
Why did you want to make this movie?
This is a very personal story. I was on October 7, 2023 in Israel for a family visit. And it was really one of the most horrible days of my life. I know a lot of friends and family that, not in my direct circle, but friends and family of mine had their family and friends either murdered on October 7 or kidnapped, and some still have hostages in Gaza. And, with all the shock, the media was not reporting everything, so we had to go online. And I remember friends of mine from all over the world, because again, New York is such a global city. So since, I've been living here for 13 years, I've had colleagues and friends from Lebanon and Belarusia and Morocco and Iran and Americans and South Americans. And what I saw on October 7 and the first week of October 7 is statements like Dervit, statements like the hostages are artificial intelligence or they are actors. And what I felt is these are people that have known me for 13 years. And if this is their response, then, what we are lacking as humans is empathy. What the movie is asking, not only why is empathy a limited resource, but also can we have difficult conversations with people that we disagree with? And the last question that is very important for me to ask is, can several things be true at the same time? And these are things that I'm trying to answer in the film.
Who is in the film? Who did you speak to?
So I reached out to about, I would say, between 30 to 40 different interviewees for the research. And I ended up with 10 subjects, which I follow. First of all, Alana and Liam Zajcek, they are siblings that live in New York. They are American Israelis. They are Yemenite Jews, and they grew up in New Jersey, but right now they live in New York. And their 7 family members of them were kidnapped on October 7. So this includes their 2 cousins, Sharon Aloni Cunio and Daniel Aloni, the kids of Daniel and Sharon. These are a twin 3-year-olds and a 5-year-old kid. So all of the names I just said were released after the first hostage deal. But the husband of Sharon, who is David Cunio, and his brother Ariel Cunio are still held hostage up until now. It's been, we're talking today. This war has been going on for over 700 days, over 100 weekends. We have a sign of life from David, but the family don't know if Ariel is alive. And then I've spoken to Julia Simon, who was a close friend and grew up in New York with Omer Neutra. He's an American Israeli who came to Israel, and the family was pretty visible in the hostage campaign because they are Americans, and they spoke in the Republican convention in front of President Trump, asking for, to release the hostages, and they were very, very vocal. Their story, every story that is connected to this war is a tragedy. Their story is unique in the sense that they advocated for a hostage deal and the release of the hostages, but they didn't know that for more than a year of advocating all of this time, their son was actually dead. And when I made the film, of course, I was sure that he's going to be released. But yeah, they talked to every politician from every country in the world because they were under the impression that their son is alive. And then I'm also talking to, I would say, activists that live in New York and they don't know any hostages, but they see the posters themselves as a sign of, I would say, it's an extension of your grief, of your belonging, of your identity. And I also talked to a rabbi from NYU who mostly talks about sociology and psychology, why people put up the posters. He says that when people are in trauma or in post-trauma, the best thing to do is act. It kind of like reminds me in Judaism, the Shiva, after someone dies, there's so much to do, not just the burial, but also, for 7 days, you're occupied with hosting people and talking about your beloved that has died. Or so I feel like when people were advocating for the hostages, this was their way of grappling with what is going on. And the last interviewee, who's very, very crucial for the documentary, is a director from an organization called FIRE, and they monitor freedom of speech in America. And he's my expert witness, and he is talking about not only the fact that tearing down a poster is taking someone's freedom of speech away from them, but he also talks about the other elements that were happening in New York in that winter of 2023. And I'm referring to the identifying and doxing of individuals who tore down the posters. So for the listeners who haven't heard about it, what happened is that so many people took down the posters. This was filmed, and there are hundreds and hundreds of videos of people tearing down the posters. These were circulated online, and then these people were identified and they were fired from their jobs, consequently, if they held positions. So if they were doctors, or if they were public officials or selected officials, or if they have a public-facing job, their organization or job didn't want anything to do with them. And, it kind of like turned into a very, very, I document the poster war, which happened on the streets of New York, but a lot of this, let's say, poster war also happened online. So the documentary weaves and zigzags real life, I would say, documentary with a lot of things that are happening on the social media sphere, from Twitter to Twitch to Instagram to TikTok to YouTube. These days there are sometimes online wars are sometimes even more, I would say online wars are part of the game, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Did it shock you, people's attitude towards the hostages in New York?
I will tell you that I intentionally didn't want to include anything from. So the film is 75 minutes, and I only included 1 minute from October 7 and 1 minute from the war in Gaza and the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding in the streets of Gaza. And the reason why is because I think people are so hurting and so triggered that I wanted to talk again. This is not a film about Israel or Gaza. It's not a film about the Middle East. It's a film about America and about every Western city that was grappling with what's happening with the hostages and the posters. But New York was kind of like, the biggest home for Jews, a huge Muslim community, and so many Americans, but also international citizens of the world that live in New York that took it very, very personal. I was very, very shocked when I first saw people ripping down the posters because, again, like living in New York for 13 years, I recognize every street. Like I saw posters ripping down on different videos, and I'm like, this is where I get coffee, and this is where I work, and this is where I used to live, and this is where I live now. So it was very, very painful for me to see that people were ripping down those posters. I would say that, watching this footage for so long, it takes a toll on your soul, and it also, you become kind of like used to the fact that there's so much hate in these videos that are being documented, because you see people fighting, and it's not even physical fighting, it's just verbal, but it's very, very hard. And I'll say that I've shown the film to so many different communities. I've shown it to, of course, Jews, but also Christians and Mormons and Muslims. And it's very fascinating to see how people look at the film and how it hits them, because I would say the film is like a very much ink block test, and there are different things you can take away from the film. So, the film again documents the first 3 months of the war, but it's a mirror to where we are now in America and maybe other parts of the world, where we can't sit down and have a conversation about difficult topics, and we are basically, choosing to ignore one another. And I think specifically, living thousands of miles away from Israel, we don't have rockets and missiles on our heads. We are not suffering, not like the Israelis, and definitely not like the Gazans. And we can have difficult conversations. We have the luxury, or the privilege, to sit down and talk to one another. And these conversations are crucial, not just for us, but honestly for the continuation of humanity and for our children and the next generations.
How did this poster campaign start?
So the poster campaign, that's a very good question, because a lot of people think it was a governmental initiative, but it actually came about from two Israeli artists that moved to New York a month before October 7. Their names are Dede Band-Aid and Nitzan Mintz, and they are street artists. Nitzan usually writes poems on walls all across Israel, but she actually had her work commissioned also in Europe and in the United States. And Dede is usually, I would say, his art is more visual. His name is Band-Aid because his work is kind of like, it's filled with Band-Aids, as, not just like a Band-Aid covering a wound. He draws these Band-Aids because there is something that we are hiding when we have a wound. So he has an entire philosophy about that. So, they came to New York thinking they would work on their art, and then October 7 happened, and they wanted to do something, and they came out with this idea for the posters, similar to the 80s and 90s campaign of the missing kids on the milk packages. And they made a poster for each of the hostages that was taken. When you watch the movie, you need to remember that on October 7 and the following weeks, we didn't know how many people were killed and how many people were taken hostage. And the fact that they took initiative was actually the first database, the first public database of missing people. So what they made is not just, I would call it artivism, part art activism, but also something very useful. You could understand the scale and the magnitude of the people that were kidnapped, 9 months to 85-year-old. And it was a very good idea. Of course, they didn't have everyone who was taking hostage, because they came out with the campaign 2 days after October 7, but they spent an entire day putting up these posters in New York. No one wanted to help them. They thought it's going to be a failure, and they wanted to go back home to Israel. And the last thing they did before going to sleep was put it up online, and then it spread like wildfire. Everyone in the world downloaded those posters from their website. And, the morning after, they saw that people put up the posters in places that they didn't put them up. So they were surprised to see this catch on so fast. And they, they are kind of like responsible for good and for better and for worse for what happened. The film, of course, interviews them. I forgot to mention their name because it's obvious for me that they are in the film. But the film starts with them and ends with them, because they created something that is, bigger than all of us. At one point, the posters were not theirs anymore. It was the people's. And I see it as kind of like they gave the fire to the people, but the people are the ones that decide how to use that fire.
Now, there's been over 700 days since October the 7th, and we still have hostages in Gaza. Is there any sympathy at all today for those hostages, or is the focus really fixed on Gaza at the moment?
I would say that everything that we are able to save, we need to save. And out of the 48 hostages, we know that 20 are alive. Trump said that there may be less, but it doesn't really matter. Everyone that we can save, we need to save. We never know if Hamas knows where all the, Hamas is not the one that is holding all the terrorists. There are different terrorist groups inside Gaza that hold some of the hostages. And it's a very, very dark thought, but maybe some of the hostages will never be found because the terrorists don't know where they are. But I think, if you ask me, that releasing the hostages, the dead ones for burial, and the live ones to be united with their families is what we need to end this war. And I also want to remind the listeners that what gives me hope these days is that more than 75% of Israelis want this war to end at all cost because we prioritize the hostages over anything. These are our brothers and our sisters, and it could have been us. So this is what gives me hope. And I also want to remind the listeners that what got the majority of the hostages out was diplomatic efforts and not a continuation of the war. And that is what is key. My heart goes out to, it's, if you had a time machine and asked me on October 7 how long the war would last, no one could have predicted that it would go for such a long time. And, thousands of innocent Israelis have been killed. Tens of thousands of innocent Gazans have been killed. I tell this to a lot of people that I know, that between the river and the sea, there's enough space for both the Israelis and the Palestinians. No one is going anywhere. And the only way forward is coexistence. It's not going to happen tomorrow, of course. But if Israel has peace with Egypt and with Jordan, and collaborations with the PLO. And, we're hearing today about talks of normalization with Syria. If Israel has peace with Germany, then, we owe it to the future generations of at least trying to talk to one another. It's going to be hard, but we have to find a solution because we just have to, for a better world for everyone.
Have you personally experienced anti-Semitism since October the 7th?
That's a very good question, and I will say that it's been very hard since October 7, 2023, because, some of us experience anti-Semitism very personal, and some of my interviewees have been called really disgusting things in their faces. I know that people talk about me behind my back because friends of mine who heard it told me so, but I think what is happening right now to a lot of Israelis, but also a lot of Jews, is a form of silent boycott. I know family members of mine who live in North America have been uninvited from weddings. Friends of mine who are single and are on dating apps or, meeting one another in a bar. Once they said where they're from, they have gotten horrible responses. And, we're not talking about those micro cases, I would say, because there is just so much suffering going on. But yeah, it's very, very present. I see it on stickers when I go to work or to my commute. There is hate in a lot of different spaces. And it's a very, very hard time. And I'll tell you, again, I've screened the film both in cinemas. It's coming out on VOD on torn-film.com. But I've also screened it in a lot of colleges. I've done Columbia and Harvard and Stanford and NYU. And I think that Jewish students right now have it the worst. I think that these are 18-year-olds that have never experienced anything like this. And, they are Jewish, but, to tie them or to connect them to what is happening, this complicity that we're seeing is very, very hard. So I'm in my early 40s, but for Jewish students and teenagers, I think what they are going through right now is horrible. And, every screening, someone talks to me. The other day, someone who's in her early 50s told me that she's suffering from anti-Semitism in her workplace, and she has been talking to the HR department and they are afraid to act. So there are so many stories like this. So I also see it happening to me, but there are far worse stories than what's happening to me right now.
What is your prayer for the movie?
Well, that's such a good question. I screened the film in New York for a week and I did Q&A. And one days I had to skip the Q&A and the usher told me that people stayed in the cinema after the credits ended and they spoke with each other and he had to tell them that they need to leave for the next show. So my prayer is that people speak with one another, people have hard conversations with one another. We have to, there's a beautiful, beautiful story about. I heard it. It's a rabbinical story, but you can use it. It's about a rabbi that is being asked, "When will the long night end? Will it be when we see the lines on the leaves on the tree, or will it be when we see our hands and those lines on our hands?" And the rabbi answers that the long night will end when we see our face in the eyes of the other. And I'm asking people for empathy. I'm praying for empathy. We don't have to agree about everything. We need to listen to each other's narratives and stories because, that's the only way forward. And empathy is not a limited resource. I can have empathy for people that are suffering. I don't need to choose. I don't need to be pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian. I need to be pro-human. And we have to remind ourselves that this is, when I'm talking about empathy, we can never stand in the shoes of someone else because we don't know what they're going through, but we can try. We can try to step outside from our own shoes for a second. People are going through so much right now, so I'm praying for more patience and more empathy. And thank you so much for having me and listening.
What's your website for people who'd like to know more about this film?
So the website is www.torn-film.com. And on the website, you can host a screening and you can also watch it yourself. But I'm, hosting a screening for your community, for your interfaith centers, for your church or synagogue. I'm so much interested in those conversations of communities. So feel free to reach out. And again, thank you so much for having me.
Well, Nim, thank you very much for sharing today.
Thank you.